seen the earlier ones. This afternoon I want to talk a little bit about the Antarctic Treaty. Now, I know everyone knows in detail about the Antarctic Treaty, right? Okay, well, I'm done. Okay. I want to talk about a little bit about the political history of Antarctica, and probably the most important question is, who's in charge? The treaty, you have to put yourself in the perspective of the time frame. This was an international agreement that was negotiated in 1959. And sometimes when I do a talk similar to this with a younger group of people, they have no idea what I'm talking about, but you can remember what the global political atmosphere was in that time period. There's quite a bit of tension, particularly between the United States and the former Soviet Union. International collaboration and cooperation was kind of a foreign concept. And the treaty was discussing two significant issues. There was a significant potential threat for international conflict over areas in the Antarctic, and it was a unique opportunity for the nations of the world to continue a collaboration in science that occurred during the International Geophysical Year, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. The big concern, the big issue was territorial claims. The United Kingdom made a territorial claim in 1908 with some prodding from the UK. New Zealand made a claim in 1923. Australia followed with a claim in 1933. France, of course, followed immediately after Australia with a claim in 1924. And then Norway and Chile and Argentina made claims. The Chilean and Argentinian claims were just before World War II, but the interesting portion, of course, is Great Britain, Argentina, and Chile all claim the same territory. There was some significant issues and concerns, and actually Germany under Hitler had an expedition to Antarctica in 1939, but they didn't make any territorial claims. When you look at the picture, you'll notice this area is unclaimed. The United States, many of the actual claimant nations fully expected the United States to make a claim, and they more or less reserved that part of the pie for the United States. U.S. certainly had plenty of bases to make a claim based on early explorers, but it was quite interesting that both the United States, and you notice there's one other major world power that doesn't have a claim, the Soviet Union. Both countries had the same policy. They didn't make a claim, nor did they recognize any other country's claim. During World War II and right after World War II, the issues of territorial sovereignty were becoming of great concern. There was some significant concern that the Germans are actually during the war going to set up some bases in the Antarctic Peninsula region, and the British, United Kingdom, set up a number of stations in the Antarctic Peninsula to ensure that the Germans did not move into the area. There was a little conflict between Argentina and Great Britain, and there actually were some shots fired in Antarctica, in an area where we get close to in Hope Bay. Argentinians fired on or over the heads of a United Kingdom field party near the Hope Bay area. So the issue of Antarctica trusteeship was brought to the United Nations, a fairly new organization post-World War II, but becoming a very major player in the world politics. it didn't go anywhere in the UN forum because some of the the claimant nations said they would not allow anything to pass they would veto anything in the United Nations forum. There was another discussion about having something that they called a condominium, where they would have a group of countries manage the Antarctic that would include the 7 claimant countries and the United States. The Soviet Union made it very clear that they would object to that, so that issue died. Well, the big push came post-IGY. IGY was the International Geophysical Year. Those occur about every 50 years. In 1957-58, the previous geophysical year was almost exclusively Arctic. But a lot of technology, a lot of capability had come into place post-war that could be applied to the Antarctic regions. So IGY, there was a huge scientific effort in the Antarctic, collaborative, numerous nations, lots of technology and logistics. They were looking at geophysical sciences in both the Arctic and the Antarctic region. 12 nations participated in the IGY. That included all the claimant nations: Argentina, Australia, Chile, France, New Zealand, Norway, and the United Kingdom, plus Belgium, Japan, South Africa, the Soviet Union, and the United States. An organization was formed internationally called SCAR, which is the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research. Non-governmental body, usually the leading national Academy of Sciences or equivalent in all those countries was the party that was involved with SCAR, and they coordinated the science activities of all the countries that were working in Antarctica. There were over 40 different scientific stations established around Antarctica to support research during IGY. Over 5,000 people were in the Antarctic for that period. One of the pre-meetings took place in Paris, France, and during the meeting, the U.S. delegation had understood the Soviet Union was going to announce plans to put a station in the interior of Antarctica. So the U.S. delegation quickly jumped up and said, we're going to put a station at the geographic South Pole. The group responsible for the operations and logistics to support that station, they all fell out of their chair because they had never heard of any plans to put a station at the South Pole. That was the Navy at the time. It was all news to them, but they suddenly got that dropped in their lap to organize to put a station at the South Pole during IGY. Tremendous success. The Soviet Union also established a station in the interior at what's called the Pole of Inaccessibility at Vostok Station. Lots of joint experiments between the United States and all the other countries. Most of the stations that were established had international groups on the station. Then they did work in geology, glaciology, geomagnetism, meteorology, and upper atmospheric physics. Once that activity concluded, the science personnel from each one of those nations recognized it was absolutely essential to continue that kind of cooperative effort. So they were able to press the issue with the politicians to say, we need to figure out a way to get past the differences with territorial claims and sovereignty issues so we can continue to pursue our research in the Antarctic. So they began this discussion and negotiation for the Antarctic Treaty. The United States actually called for a meeting in mid-1958, and the negotiations started, and by December 1st of 1959, a treaty was agreed to and signed by those 12 initial IGY countries, all claimants, all the 7 countries that had claims, and the 5 countries that didn't have claims, including the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Then, of course, once you get the treaty signed, you have to take it back to your nation and go through the process within your own government structure to get everybody to approve it. So the treaty did not come into force until the end of June 1961. It applies to everywhere south of 60 degrees south. And that's important for all you, because I'll talk about that towards the end of the lecture of why. There are some rules and regulations that apply to us and as we're on this cruise. The main thing with the treaty was several, but it provides for the freedom of scientific research in Antarctica. If you wish to go to the area in the Antarctic Peninsula that Argentina, Great Britain, and Chile all claim, you don't have to ask their permission. You can go there and do research. All of the research activities, all the plans are exchanged in advance between the countries. SCAR is actively working with all the countries, so there's no duplication. People aren't doing the same science research unless it's a good idea to duplicate in some cases, or in a different location you'd want to do that. And all that information is shared freely. If you're a principal investigator on a research project in Antarctica, of course you get a couple of years to do your data analysis and publish, but after that you're expected, or you're required, to have that all publicly available to anybody that wants it. The whole region was also reserved exclusively for peaceful purposes. Military activities, other than providing logistics support to the science research activities, are not allowed. No military bases, no testing of weapons. You can all remember back in those days, in the late 50s, there was a lot of discussion about what are we going to do with all this nuclear waste that we're generating, and there was a movement of, hey, we've got a great place to dispose of it, we'll just dump it in Antarctica, it won't hurt anything except a few penguins or something. The treaty specifically prohibits testing of nuclear weapons or explosions in Antarctica and the disposal of radioactive waste. It does not prohibit the use of radioactive materials, which are done in scientific experiments, but you can't have any of the waste disposed of. And it does not prohibit the use of nuclear power if you chose to do that. You just cannot dispose of your waste. The other big provision in the treaty was the right for on-site inspections. Believe it or not, this was the very first international treaty that ever had a provision for inspections. The first treaty signed by the United States and the Soviet Union, they had a provision for inspections of other countries' facilities. So if you're appointed by the appropriate agency within your government, and in the United States, that's the Department of State, as a treaty inspector, you can go into any other country's facilities and look at anything they have there. The other big issue was, what do we do about the territorial claims? And the treaty was brilliant. It basically said, this is too hard a problem to solve. So it said, nothing you do during the period of the treaty will enhance nor detract from your rights to make a claim. So they just took that issue and put it in a box over here. So if you still want to have a claim, that's fine. If you don't have one now, you want to have one later, that's fine. But you don't have to recognize anyone's claim. Brilliant. Amazing. And it worked. Now, the other big provision in the treaty is they recognized that there were going to be new issues and new things that needed to be addressed. So they set up a system of consultative meetings. They meet every year, and any of the treaty parties can bring up issues. They have a very interesting decision-making process that on first blush you would think it would be a disaster, but it's not. It has to be unanimous. If there's a provision brought up to change or amend the treaty or bring in some new regulations, it's by consensus. Every single member of the treaty, every party must agree. And so nothing happens real fast in that forum, but you do get consensus. The other big issue, and this is actually the old station at South Pole, the other big issue was the continuing collaboration with a non-government organization, the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research. They invited that group to meetings. That group was actively involved and continues to this day to be actively involved to coordinate the science activities between all the countries, to again eliminate duplication of efforts. SCAR predated the treaty, and it's a tremendous resource for any country that is interested in doing any work in the Antarctic. That's actually an image of Palmer Station. Now, those legal provisions turned out to be extremely successful. Peaceful purposes and cutting-edge science continue to be one of the goals of all the countries that are working in Antarctica. It's unbelievable that we had an arms disarmament agreement between the U.S. and the Soviet Union in 1960. Plenty of us in this audience remember that in those time periods, that's when your kids went to high school and they taught them how to hide under the desk, and you maybe had some place out in your backyard where you had a hole in the ground and all those things. That potential for international disagreement, we took an area that was 1.5 times the size of the United States and set it aside for peaceful purposes. Truly, truly amazing. But that was in 1961. So while it worked, the question is, what's happened since then within the treaty system? Those are the original signatory flags from the old station at Pole in front of the new station at Pole. There have been 4 major new conservation agreements worked out under the treaty at the consultative meetings. One of them on Antarctic seals that was signed in 1972. There was a convention on the conservation of marine living resources called CAMLR that was signed also in 1972. And then they started to struggle with the big issue, which is mineral resources and the environment. In the late 50s, most of us rode down the road in a car and threw things out the window and didn't think anything about it. And when they signed the Antarctic Treaty, most of them didn't know how to spell environment. It wasn't an issue that was on the table. By the late 80s, it was becoming a significant issue to be concerned with. So they were trying to address environmental protection under the Antarctic Treaty system, as well as struggle with the issue of marine resources. So minerals and the two went hand in hand, interestingly enough. Hard to think about that, but they did, because when they started to do some negotiations on mineral resources, they wanted to come up with environmental protection at the same time. So those two conventions were discussed in detail. And there was a real concern about exploitation or over-exploitation. They had addressed that with the living resources, with the SEAL Convention and CAMLR, but nothing was in place to deal with minerals. Minerals are different. minerals are non-renewable. They don't mitigate. You start mining and you have big problems, and it also is usually the main thing behind any sovereignty or jurisdictional claims. So the treaty countries said, let's try to get in front of this wave. They recognized the scientists were out, the geologists were out doing geology, and they were looking at minerals, not so much exploitation as exploration, but they were looking at it, and they recognized that was going to become an issue. This became the big, serious problem for the treaties nations to agree on. And of course, once they started talking about minerals, lots of other countries said, whoa, wait, I want to get my piece of the pie. So other countries started to say, can we be part of the Antarctic Treaty? And the issue is pretty straightforward. Yes, you can. Sign an agreement, sign the treaty. You want to be a full voting member, you have to have an active program in Antarctica. Lots more countries suddenly became players. So in the late 1981, the parties had an agreement negotiated to deal with the possibility of oil development and mining. And that got the attention of some other groups, non-government groups. Probably the most famous, or one that most folks know, Greenpeace, but also Southern Oceans Coalition and a number of other organizations realized that there was something they needed to get involved in, and they became active in the discussions. They were leading the charge to designate the whole Antarctic region as a world park and make it off limits to mineral exploitation and any other commercial activities. A number of them also thought we should stop sending anybody to Antarctica and not do any science there either. I'm not sure how you could have a park and not send anybody there, but that was also actively discussed. And the treaty countries were, I don't know, they thought they had an agreement, but that Convention on Regulation of Mineral Resources Activities was adopted by consensus in 1998. But then when they took it back to their national governments, it wasn't agreed to, and it died. And there was a time period where we thought that was going to be the end of the Antarctic Treaty. But once again, the countries sat down and recognized there's a way to solve this problem. Let's look at our history, what we have done before with difficult problems. Things were starting to unravel, and they returned to the negotiating table. And they looked at all the work they did on the environmental protocol to protect the Antarctic that was supposed to be associated with mineral exploitation, and they said, this is good stuff here. So they adopted, by consensus, the protocol on environmental protection under the Antarctic Treaty. And then they followed the same kind of course that they did with the issue of territorial claims. They banned mineral exploitation for 50 years. So in 2041, that issue will come back up again. They also had a whole series of binding annexes that spell out lots of details on the environmental protocol. Once all the dust settled, they looked around and they went, we have now 53 countries that have signed the Antarctic Treaty, representing 80% of the world's population. And the other question that comes up from time to time is, when does the treaty end? Well, in 1991, there's a provision in the treaty after 30 consecutive years, any of the signatory nations, the full voting members that have an active program, could ask for a review. Nobody did. 1991 came and went. Nobody asked for any reviews. The treaty does not ever end. It goes on in perpetuity. So those waste annexes, each country took those back, the waste protocol, the environmental protocol, took them back to their countries, and those were put into regulations or legislation of the individual country. In the United States, they're covered by something called the Antarctic Conservation Act. I would love to tell you all about it. It's about an inch thick. There are Antarctic Conservation Act enforcement officers. They carry a badge. They have training in law enforcement. They have the authority to search and seize material and information. They can then write their reports and go forward recommending penalties and fines. My daughters used to laugh because they said, Dad was a penguin policeman. Under the Antarctic Conservation Act, if you have a penguin feather in your possession and you import it into the United States, you have a $15,000 penguin feather in your hand, because that's against the law. You can't approach any of the local wildlife unless you have a permit. It also has a long list of rules and regulations about waste management and waste disposal. Some of them are obvious, but there are some other oddball ones like polystyrene peanuts that you see in packaging. They're illegal in Antarctica, because you know what happens if they blow out of your box and they blow around, and you can never get rid of the things. So actually the contractors that work in the U.S. program, when all the material comes to the logistics center in Port Hueneme, California, everything is carefully looked at, so if they're packaged in styrofoam peanuts, that all gets taken out before it gets sent to Antarctica. There's rules about how they handle disposal of waste, chemicals, plastics, all kinds of rules and regulations, garbage for your station operations. So the treaty that was signed in '59, it addressed the issue of who's in charge. The environmental protocol that didn't go into effect, it was signed in '91, but didn't have enough nations, all the treaty nations agreed to it until '98. But the U.S. went ahead with the provisions of the treaty before that. That went into effect in '98. So they really have made huge strides. The question is, who is in charge? Well, originally it was those 12 consultative parties. Now it's all of the nations that are signatories to the Antarctic Treaty. The negotiations leading up to that protocol really redefined and brought in so many more players, not only the other nations, but the other groups with interest like Greenpeace, like the Southern Oceans Coalition, who have made tremendous inputs to the treaty system in a very positive way. So the new actors are the consultative parties, where there's a much more diverse group now in the treaty. And it's not just the countries that you would think of. I mean, when you got the other major nations in South America, it wasn't just Argentina and Chile anymore. You know, Brazil and a number of Uruguay and a number of other South American countries are signatories. India is a signatory, China is a signatory, South Korea and North Korea are signatories. With the breakup of the Soviet Union, a number of those countries are all signatories to the Antarctic Treaty. So it's an amazing group of people. The non-consultative parties, those countries that signed the treaty but elected not to scratch your head about, like why Papua New Guinea signed the Antarctic Treaty, but they did, and they come to the meetings. And then all those other non-governmental groups that are invited these days to attend the treaty meetings and make input to the treaty meetings. Of course, they don't vote or anything, and they're closed sessions, but they do make significant contributions to how it's managed. But there are now over 200 different agreed measures adopted by the treaty, and they address the environmental issues. They've taken sites of special scientific interest and set those aside. So if you want to go in there, you have to have a permit to go into that particular area, so it's not disturbed just by anyone. There are historic sites that are set aside with a management plan associated with them. So if you go to McMurdo, to the Ross Sea region, and you want to go see the Discovery Hut, they're only allowed to have 2,000 people into that hut during a calendar year. That includes all the people at McMurdo and Scott Base, as well as any cruise ship that might get in the area. And you can only have 8 people inside the hut at a time, and you must have a qualified guide with you. Otherwise, the door is locked. There's a lot of those kinds of provisions in the treaty, as well as the Kandahar provision as part of the system. It is absolutely amazing to me that you could get 12 countries in 1959, when you looked at that list of countries, to agree. Particularly the Soviet Union and the United States, but also Chile and Argentina and Great Britain, that all had overlapping claims, and to agree. But for this system to continue today, it's truly, truly remarkable. And people always ask, why don't they copy it? And there actually are parts of the Antarctic Treaty, especially the inspections and disarmament provisions in the treaty, that are part of other international treaties today. I actually was appointed, I was reading a report from a U.S. treaty inspection group one year, and as I was reading through it, it became obvious to me anyway, that some of the inspectors did not have an in-depth background of what they were looking at when they went to some other country's station. Of course, you have their list of everything their plans are and what they're going to do to look at, but they didn't know what they were looking at. So I wrote what I thought was going to be an internal memo about that, and the next U.S. treaty inspection group that went, I boarded an icebreaker in McMurdo Station and stayed on board for 6 weeks as part of the U.S. inspection team. So I got to be an inspector, and I've done that 3 times now for the Department of State. Now, one of the provisions in the treaty under those environmental protocols deals with tourism. And I want to talk to you a little bit about that, because we are all going to be directly affected by that. As I said to you earlier, the area of the Antarctic Treaty that it covers is any area south of 60 degrees south. So when this ship reaches that location, we are covered under those provisions. This ship cannot burn heavy fuel south of 60 degrees. This ship cannot carry heavy fuel south of 60 degrees. So the captain and the engineers have calculated very carefully how much heavy fuel they have on board, and they will be burning that off before we get south of 60 degrees. When we are south of 60 degrees, please, no food on the outside decks. You saw some pictures of birds earlier. If the birds come in, if you're out on the deck with food, and that bird comes in, you're in violation of the Antarctic Treaty under the U.S. laws, because this company operates from a U.S. company, so they have a permit from the Environmental Protection Agency to come here. No waste over the side. So please be careful if you're outside with a container with your coffee with a lid on it, please. Be careful with the wind that doesn't get blown off. No smoking on the outside decks when we're south of 60 degrees. There'll be a location on the vessel. I believe it's a small corner in that heavily used casino on board that you can smoke. Please be careful when you're out on deck. If you're pulling your pockets out of your parka, you're pulling your gloves out, make sure you're not dropping any trash on the deck that might blow over. It is illegal to dump anything over the side when we're south of 60 degrees. And I cannot tell you again about food, because these boys are much better at scavenging than you are, and they will come in and get you. And if they do, that's illegal. And they are well briefed. Trust me, you don't want a skua coming in, and if you've got something, they're going to hit you in the head first, and they're a pretty big bird. But please be careful of that. We will remind you a couple more times before we get to 60 South what the rules are, but we don't want to have any problems. This ship also operates under a permit that, because of the number of passengers on board, we cannot do any shore visits. You have to have 500 or less. We're slightly over that. We also don't anchor while we're south of 60 degrees. And unless it's an emergency, we don't even have a permit to put a boat in the water. So when we get offshore from Palmer Station on Saturday, they come out to the ship to do a lecture on the ship. We don't go in and pick them up. They'll come out in their small boats, come alongside. So if you're up real early, I think they're due to get on at 6 in the morning, but they give a talk at 9 and again at 11 in this same place. Don't know who's coming from the station. It'll be a mix of science personnel and support staff. They have a short brief, and then they'll sit on stage and take questions from folks. It was interesting on the last group, the person who got the most questions was the station chef. And I don't know how many passengers have said, oh, how nice they can come on board the ship and get a shower and have a nice meal. And, last time I was at Palmer, I think we still had showers there, and I guarantee you they have a good chef on the station. That's one of the most important jobs on any Antarctic station. So that's the Antarctic Treaty. Amazingly successful international agreement that's been in place since 1961. So now I don't see it's going to end. I'm sure there'll be new issues that come up by 2041 with the minerals exploitation issue. But hopefully by then things will have changed, and we'll be doing other things for energy. I can take a few questions if you've got. Yes, sir.
You talk about non-governmental organizations. You talk about National Geographic, Exxon.
Non-governmental organizations are normally groups. Yeah, they're groups like Greenpeace. People like there's a Southern Oceans Coalition. Greenpeace actually had a small base close to McMurdo Station. They gave us help in doing cleanup activity at McMurdo. Actually, we were doing cleanup activity before Greenpeace figured out how to spell Antarctica, but that's my personal opinion. But it actually was very effective because Greenpeace was in Antarctica. Some people way above my pay grade at NSF made sure that Congress knew that it would be good if they gave us a little more extra funding so we could accelerate our cleanup activities at McMurdo, which we did. And I'll show you some pictures of that activity in a later presentation. But mostly there are those kinds of groups. A group like Exxon or those groups, in my opinion, because the situation is so unclear in Antarctica, they're not going to come in and invest the billions of dollars. And from a standpoint of trying to, the offshore area of Antarctica is much deeper than anywhere else around the world because of that 9,000 feet of ice on top. So trying to drill, even if there was oil there, and it probably is, it would be far more complex. And then what do you do with it? You build a pipeline from the Antarctic Peninsula to, you can only get ships in there for a short period of time. I don't see that happening for a long, long time. Of course, people said the same thing about oil in the North Slope, but hopefully by the time it will be potentially economical, we'll have found other sources of renewable energy. won't have to be so dependent on coal and petroleum. There's coal, there's plenty of coal deposits in Antarctica. They're such poor quality that if they were in your backyard at home, you wouldn't mind them because they're really poor quality. So that's